The views and content expressed on the Pop Culture Courtroom are provided solely for educational and entertainment purposes and do not constitute legal advice. For any legal matters, please consult with a licensed attorney.
Welcome back to the Pop Culture Courtroom. I'm Matt Hardin.
And I'm William Mayfield, and today we are talking about Ted Lasso, specifically Season 2, Episode 8.
Ted Lasso is a show that we both enjoy very much. It's Jason Sudeikis playing a relentlessly positive American coach who coaches college football for Wichita State and is hired by a divorcee who's trying to wreck the AFC Richmond team in order to get back at her ex-husband, Rupert, who loves the team more than anything. It's a takeoff of the great baseball movie Major League. It's a very similar story, except she's just trying to move that team to Florida so she can sell it. And here, Rebecca's trying to destroy the team and get them relegated.
And while it's a bit of an outlandish storyline, I think it did a pretty good job of achieving what had to happen for this show to happen, which is getting Ted Lasso, who is an American and not a super knowledgeable in terms of soccer American, over to England to coach a soccer team. And the origin of this show is actually based on some commercials that NBC ran when they were trying to promote the Premier League in 2013 and 2014, where Jason Sudeikis played a character that was going to coach the Tottenham Hotspur, which is a team in London. And he was getting interviewed about soccer, and he didn't know anything about soccer. And so I think that that's really what they were trying to achieve, which was to say, hey, Americans, soccer is about to become a bigger part of your life. And little did they know, in 2020, when Ted Lasso came around with basically the same premise, that was going to happen.
I'd never much followed the Premier League, and William here got me interested in watching some of these documentaries during COVID time when we didn't have a lot of sports. We're both very sports interested people, and so not having sports for a while, I watched a whole series of documentaries on Amazon, on Netflix with Sunderland. I watched everything from Man City to the stuff on Borussia Dortmund, all the ones that he recommended, and I've followed the Premier League ever since then, and it's pretty fascinating to me how that whole league is set up.
We're going to get into this a little bit later in the relevant evidence, but I think one of the fascinating things about sports are some of the similarities that it has in bringing people together around the world and the way they celebrate sports, but also some of the different ways they do things. And quite frankly, I think Matt and I really agree that some of the things that the way that international soccer and European soccer handle things, we could learn a lesson or two in America from how they do that.
Yeah, and we'll save most of that for our relevant evidence, but I will say the central premise of this show, which is Rebecca trying to get this team relegated, the value of a Premier League team versus the value of a championship level teams, which is the next level of major soccer in England, is a massive difference in what her net worth is going to be. I mean, that's got to be by far the premier asset that she got in that divorce.
And before people start going off in the comments, we are Americans. We're going to call it soccer.
Mm-hmm.
If you want to call it football, that's fine, but we're going to call it soccer. So Matt, set up the episode for us.
All right, so this particular season one, the two villains of the show that year are Jamie Tartt, who's this very, very good young soccer player who's arrogant, and Ted working on him to help him be a better teammate and better person. And then the secondary conceit is about Rebecca trying to get this team relegated. They ultimately get relegated, so they're sent down to the championship level. The second season is much more related to Nate taking a heel turn, slowly through the season because he doesn't feel valued. And then the secondary storyline that they go through the whole season is about the mental health of Ted, the players, and other characters that are involved in the show. So episode 1 of the second season involves Danny Rojas, who is, from my perspective, almost like a Ted on the field. He's a very positive character. He's the football is life guy. He's just great. But in the first game they show in this season, he is taking a kick and kills the mascot, which is a greyhound for AFC Richmond.
The interesting part about Danny Rojas and Sam. They really highlight how in European soccer, something that we're not as accustomed to in American sports is that cultures have to come together in locker rooms. There's different languages, there's different cultures, there's different people view the sports different ways, and that's something almost every European soccer team has to deal with. Over here in America, we deal with it a little bit more in hockey and baseball probably than the other sports, but nowhere near to the level that they do in soccer because it's really a blending of cultures. But it's fun to see these different types of people come together for a common cause.
Yeah, and Danny's very upset by this. He thinks there's bad luck associated with it. And where this show really shines is the relationships of the characters within the context of the soccer and the soccer within the English Premier League, and where it sometimes strays a bit from that, and we get apart from the soccer, the show struggles a bit.
So at this point, the team has kind of gotten over the hurdle of the killing of the Greyhound, and they're trying to go for an FA Cup championship. And so in England, there's multiple different competitions going on at one time. You've got the battle for the Premier League regular season, but they also have a tournament going on called the FA Cup. There are other tournaments going on as well that we'll get into later. But in this scenario, they have made it to the semifinals of the FA Cup.
What is the FA Cup? How is that tournament set up anyway?
So there are lots of different levels of soccer in England. They have what's called promotion and relegation. So in general, 3 teams from the top league will go down to the one lesser league each year, and that team will send 3 teams up. And there's different ways to do that. The FA Cup is unique in that it's not just the top teams. I believe teams going all the way down to the 9th league in England play in this cup. So if you happen to have a team that is really basically semi-professional, for lack of a better term, put together a team and is playing in a very tiny stadium, and they put together 10 or 11 wins in a row, they could end up playing against a powerhouse in the FA Cup final. And that's kind of one of the beautiful things about English soccer is that there are a lot of underdog stories because of the opportunities that it provides.
Well, after about the first 5 levels of the professional ranks, there's a massive drop off, and a lot of these teams, Premier League team like AFC Richmond, they would not be playing the early rounds of that tournament. They all get buys going in, and then some of these lower teams fight their way up. But there's been years when, a championship level team wins that.
Well, that said, in this particular season, AFC Richmond is still in the championship, and they're in the final 4 of this. So it wouldn't be the biggest upset of all time, but it would certainly be considered kind of a fairy tale story.
So let's get into the legal part of the show that we're going to talk about today. We start the episode with Dr. Fieldstone talking to what appears to be her therapist on the phone, and is upset that Ted Lasso has not opened up to her. The therapist basically tells her, I don't think you've opened up to him either. That will help set his guard down. She goes out on a bike ride and, is messing with people along the way, telling some guy to take the sweater off a dog. And she makes a turn and a car pulls. They're on the opposite side of the road than they would be here because that's how they drive in England, and hits her with the car. And it may be the fastest car wreck sequence that I've ever seen. I mean, I think I slowed this thing down 10 times trying to figure out what had happened. And ultimately, what I believe is the Ted Lasso folks are trying to save some money on their budget, not having to actually show the wreck.
This is the most I felt like I was working on an actual case since we started this podcast. We'll get dash cam videos or videos from local businesses or traffic lights or whatever, and we'll have to rewind those a lot of the time looking for certain facts that we may want to ask about in a deposition or things like that. I agree with you. I I would pause it. I mean, it's like a second long, and I think they are almost specifically, and this might be the conspiracy theorist in me. I think they're specifically trying to get us to not analyze whose fault this is. Well, too bad, because that's what we do on this show.
We definitely did it.
So I rewound it quite a lot. And my conclusion, I'm doing everything in reverse. The steering wheel's on the opposite side of the car, and they drive on the opposite side of the road. And there's no lines on that road either. It's one of those kind of old brick roads, but it's still clear which side of the road you should be on. Based on my conclusion, the car made a very fast turn, so it wasn't keeping a proper lookout, and it turned from a legal driving position into the wrong lane, and Dr. Sharon was in the correct lane and got hit. So in my opinion, this is a 100-0. The person who made the turn was completely at fault.
I will say with comparative fault, we've talked about many times on our podcast, has to do with the percentages of fault different people are responsible for. A jury starts with 100, and you can assign 1 to 99%, 100% to the various parties, and it can be different percentage or different people. I have found, having done a lot of bicycle cases in the past, that a jury tends to place some fault on bicycles, whether they should or not, just as a nature of, oh, should the bicycle be on a road where cars are? And bicycles are certainly allowed to be on the road as long as they are adhering to the laws of that particular community. In Europe, in particular, there's a ton more people riding bicycles, riding Vespas and scooters than there are cars. Europe is way more compact than the United States, so you're able to drive some of these smaller vehicles, smaller Vespas and bicycles, and get a lot farther than you would, say, if you were in Ted Lasso's home state of Kansas, which I've driven across once, and it seemed like it would never, ever, ever end.
I agree with most everything you just said. One point where I think where we disagreed a little bit is that I think the show was trying to portray Sharon as a responsible bicyclist. She had a helmet on. She was using her bell to notify people that she was behind them. And I think they were trying to show us that she was not at fault for this because she was trying to be responsible.
She doesn't seem to be a very experienced bike rider to me. For somebody who says that cycling is her passion, doesn't seem to be very astute, and you can tell by the way she's riding the bike that it's not something she's particular experienced with. And, I talked about this fault issue a minute ago. She is riding on this bike path where all these pedestrians on like she is lord of the bikes, and what that her position is more important than the pedestrians. And that's when I talked about fault earlier, this is something that bothers a lot of folks about cyclists is they don't particularly adhere to what the rules of the road are. I mean, I see people roll through stop signs. I see them roll through traffic lights sometimes. So a lot of times these cyclists believe that they have extra rights and powers than just frankly just disobey what the laws of the rules of the road are, which they have to adhere to.
Whenever I watch like an Instagram video or TikTok, and then you watch the next one because it came up, and then you watch the next one, about that fifth one, when the algorithm is just thrown completely off, I always get some motorcyclist that's like trying to bob and weave between the lines and make passes and not really treat a red light like a red light. And there's many responsible motorcycle drivers out there, but they're not the ones that end up on TikTok. So I've seen that a lot, and I think that unfortunately they get a little bit of a bad rap as that goes along. The one thing I will say in terms of if we were going to talk about some comparative fault going to doctors, that the show makes it very clear she is distracted. She's distracted mentally with what's going on with Ted. She's talked to her own therapist, and I wouldn't be surprised to see an argument from the attorney defending the driver of the car to say that Sharon was a distracted driver.
Well, and I'll say this, a serious cyclist is not gonna wanna be riding the bike in that small English town for very long. You don't wanna have to stop and start with traffic signals and have to worry about people, so somebody who's a serious cyclist is going to get out on the country roads as quickly as they can or out on bike paths, so they're not having to stop every few seconds to deal with cars or people or dogs that go in your path. So, I mean, she definitely is distracted. I'm not sure, absent having watched this TV episode, how the driver of the car is going to know that she's distracted. But ultimately, we see her on the ground. She's laying there. The bike has been hit by the car. She's hit her head in some way. She's wearing a helmet, so that helps definitely. We see immediately as she's there, Ted Lasso is calling her. And next thing, I think she's in the hospital.
She is. Ted Lasso shows up at the hospital. She is diagnosed with a concussion, which is a very serious injury that we deal with, unfortunately, quite a lot in our practice. The show states that she has essentially left Ted 32 messages, which she cannot remember. That's not really my experience with how concussions work, probably a little creatively.
No, I mean, a concussion is probably better described as a traumatic brain injury. It's a brain injury. If your brain hits something hard or like a car or the pavement after being hit by a car, or within a car wreck itself, you just, may hit the dash or the back of a seat or something. If your brain swells up and you are, of age where your skull is fused together, which is after childhood, most people's are, if it swells, it has nowhere to go. It's a very big deal, and you can see all kinds of unusual injuries with a traumatic brain injury or concussion, and it makes you much more predisposed to have a second concussion, which leads to even more problems. But I've seen in our practice all sorts of strange injuries or manifestations come from concussions. I had a woman we represented one time who liked to go dance and couldn't go to dance places anymore because, the strobe lights would trigger seizures in her. I've had people that have lost their sense of smell, headaches that you get, loud noises that you can't deal with, really, really debilitating injuries. And they tend to be some of the hardest ones we deal with because often you're not able to look at somebody like Dr. Fieldstone and see that it looks like there's anything wrong with them at all. But these brain injuries can be the worst of what we see often. Most of the orthopedic back, leg, knee, arm injury type stuff, most of those things are going to heal up to some level one way or another. But these brain injuries, a lot of times it can follow you the rest of your life.
Yeah, I've seen the entirety of Ted Lasso, at least to the point that it exists so far. And I'm sorry for the spoiler, but we never actually figure out what comes of this car wreck with Dr. Sharon. It's one of the great unanswered questions in all of pop culture, right up there with the Sopranos in terms of ambiguity. What happens with this car wreck? I'm obviously joking, but that's what we're left to determine. The reality is, based on pretty much everything you just said, this is a very serious injury. In fact, they don't let her leave the hospital on her own accord, and she kind of has to reluctantly go with Ted. So I think we've pretty thoroughly covered how at least we would handle this in if it was in a court in Tennessee or Kentucky. It's not in Tennessee and Kentucky. It's in England, which is an entirely different country. So we're outside of state or federal law. We're actually we're overseas. So what do you know about that?
Well, I looked into it a little bit just to see how it compared, and one thing I found that I was delighted by, which is that they have a 3-year statute of limitations in England. So here in Tennessee, we have 1 year. There's many other states that have a 2-year. That's the limit of time that you have to bring a lawsuit, and if you've not either resolved your case or filed a lawsuit by then, you're out of luck. There's going to be no case. And so England having 3 years, that's wonderful. That would be great, and I think make our life a lot easier.
And it also it gives people time to heal. If you're still treating over a year later and you're also having to deal with the lawsuit starting, that can be a little bit stressful for the clients as well. So that'd be another really good reason to extend the statute if the powers that be are out there listening.
Well, and you definitely can't ever resolve a case until you're as healed as you're gotta be. We call maximum medical improvement. If you settle a case along the way and you continue to accrue medical bills and other costs, I mean, you're not getting any more money. So in England, the way it's set up there is there's really 2 types of lawyers that practice in the personal injury world. There are the solicitors and barristers. The barristers are the ones that are gonna handle your serious type cases. They may not have a whole lot of contact with the client themselves the way it's set up. The solicitors are gonna handle your more run-of-the-mill type car wreck cases, and if it appears it's a bigger case, then the solicitor goes and gets a barrister involved. I mean, they don't even do depositions there. They do witness statements. They do have damages, the money damages like the medical bills, lost wages, and also the pain and suffering. But a case in England, as I understood it, doing some brief research on this, is going to be worth less than what it's going to be worth in the United States.
I think I'm gonna start going by barrister.
It,
I, it kind of rolls off the tongue. Barrister Mayfield. Make all my friends call me that.
well, I mean, solicitor,
I'm not gonna have that. That one I'm gonna avoid.
solicitor has some bad connotation in the United States. Probably the nicest connotation of that is somebody coming to your house and trying to sell you something you don't want.
Barrister Mayfield. Take note. So, case or no case?
Definitely a case. So we don't ever hear another word that I recall about Dr. Fieldstone's, brain injury she's got. But in real life, my expectation would be that she would have to continue going to see her neurologist, her symptoms be monitored. It's possible she would have therapy related to that, may have to be medicated for it, would have her property damaged with her bike, even though Ted gave her one. The other driver needs to be paying for that. So, I mean, there 100% is a case here, and it appears to be a case of something close to complete fault on the other driver.
I agree with your summation. I think it's a case, and I think it's very close to, if not fully, full liability on the defendant driver. One thing I would caution people out there, I understand that when you get in a wreck, that maybe the first thing that you're thinking about isn't going out and getting an attorney. But the reality is, if you have medical bills, there's no magical fairy that's just going to deal with those for you. They're going to sit out there, and you need a professional to help you deal with those. And I would recommend the attorneys at Mount Hardin Law.
Well, and I'll throw one other thing on there. Dr. Fieldstone strikes me as somebody, despite being a therapist, as somebody who's wants to avoid getting medical care. And one of the biggest things you can do to harm your case after being injured in a crash like this is to delay medical care. So she has a initial visit to the emergency room where she's treated by an ER doctor, which we later find out in the series is actually Roy Kent's sister. She's going to have to follow up and do something. You know, she's being observed where Ted's calling her every 20 minutes because they don't want her to fall asleep. That's a very important deal. I mean, if she's been told to do that by the doctor, you don't just poo-poo that and go on with your day. You've got to do what the medical provider says. And then you need to follow up with medical care whenever they've told you to. So an injury like this, if they're monitoring her in that way, means that she's got to follow up in the next couple of days with a neurologist or another type of doctor that would address this type of injury. And she definitely appears to be a person that would try to avoid doing that. So as part of this episode where they're playing Man City, Jamie Tartt's father, who's all accounts a terrible person, asked for seats for him and his friend, just a couple of his buddies. He wears, Jamie's Tartt jersey, but he's rooting for Man City the entire way. And I can't imagine as a parent not rooting for your child in a game. It just tells you what an awful dad he's got. After Man City annihilates them in the game, he has to come in the locker room where he gives the business to some of the players about how they're playing. And then he keeps getting closer and closer to his son while he's admonishing him and calls him a name, pushes him. Jamie punches him in the face.
When I was watching this scene, I understand it's a situation between Jamie and his father, and oftentimes people try to let things between family members play out. But I think it got past the point where players would have just sat there. I think at a certain point, someone would have kind of held back Jamie's father because the amount of things that he said, anyone in the world would have gotten it would have gotten a rise out of them. And so it wasn't surprising to me at all that this ended up with Jamie punching his dad. I just think in a more realistic way, somebody probably would have stepped in before that happened.
I think it's a mark of respect that Jamie's earned through this season. I mean, his arc in the show, to me, really runs through this second season. They don't really have a lot to do with him in the third season other than saying he still likes Keeley. I mean, that's his main role in the third season. These first two seasons, his arc is just fantastic. I mean, he starts off as this very arrogant, excellent football player and realizes that he has to sacrifice some of himself for the team to be more successful, which is a great sports moment. His father appears to be just leeching off of him, gives him no support whatsoever. I think the teammates not getting involved. I mean, they all look very shocked in this scene while they're watching this happen, but I think it's a mark of respect to him, to a team leader that he's now become later in the year. The first season, it's all about him not making the extra pass and Ted trying to get him to help doing that.
So Ted's mark as a coach, he is exceptional at drawing out the best in people. He's a large reason why Rebecca transformed from this person who had a rightful but vindictive attitude about the club and taking her into to realizing the importance of the club to the community, which we'll talk about a little bit later in Irrelevant Evidence. He's done the same thing with Jamie Tartt. Jamie Tartt was all about himself. And as cliche as it can be, taking someone who is all about themselves and teaching them to learn to become part of a team and embrace that is not easy, especially in a situation where I can assure you, Jamie Tartt felt he was better than everyone around him, certainly including Ted. And to get him to buy into being part of the team, Ted was as exceptional at that as any real coach I've ever seen in getting the best out of people and getting them to buy into an attitude of togetherness and unity.
There's a good thing in this episode about Isaac, who is later the captain after Roy Kent retires. And I remember at the time saying that doesn't really make any sense. We barely know who this character is, and we find out in this episode that he has a tradition of giving each member of the team a haircut. Like he has this extra talent where he can give really good haircuts, and it's a bonding thing he does as the captain of the team to give something extra to the players around him, and it humanizes him in a way that is, I think, very real with the team within a team stuff, and it's a great moment for Isaac in this episode.
Yeah, the reality is that even in a show that's constantly looking for storylines, by this point in this show, the storyline of the team not getting along or the team not being together, that's already been dealt with because Ted's culture is so great that that's not it's really Richmond against the world.
So let's talk about the punch for a minute. So does Jamie's delightful father have a case based on his son punching him in the face in the locker room after their FA Cup loss?
Yes, but not a good one. He instigated much of this. He's not a very sympathetic figure. A jury's going to hear that he goes in his son's locker room after using his son's free tickets, wearing a jersey opposite of his son, and then basically antagonizes his son. All of the witnesses to this incident are people who think highly of Jamie and don't think highly of the father. By the letter of the law, sure, but civilly convincing 12 people to have sympathy for this figure and reward him damages is gonna be next to impossible.
I think it's gonna be a particularly hard case because the dad physically touches him first. I mean, you could argue, that the son has turned his back on him to try to get out of the situation, and dad escalates it. So, I mean, I think it's a terrible case, and I don't think it's gonna go anywhere. I mean, if juries don't like you, you've got a very hard row to go. I mean, the best jury results are almost always from people that are making the best out of a bad situation and have the best attitude they can about it. It's never, "I feel sorry for you." It's much more about, "It's this bad thing has happened. I've done the best I can," and that's a very human thing to relate to, and here, Jamie's trying to do the best he can with a terrible, terrible father.
Yeah, and the father, by all accounts, started this situation. It was his level of escalation that even got it to this point, and I think most people are gonna view what Jamie did at this point as a reasonable reaction.
Needed punching, that's what you
Yeah.
call it. Far as, case or no case, I think no case.
It's a no case for me. Someone might decide to take it on. I just don't view it, at least from a civil perspective, as being a successful case for all the reasons that we talked about. So for me, it's a no case.
Yeah, if I'm defending this case, I tell him, "Defend the case. Let him go look awful in court, and you're gonna win ultimately." We're now gonna move on to irrelevant evidence. So what are we gonna talk about today, Wayne?
So we're going to talk about the significant differences in soccer in Europe and American sports.
So here in Nashville, we have the Nashville SC MLS team. I think there's about 30 MLS teams. Is that system set up the same way the Premier League system is set up in England?
It's not, and there's actually been a lot of talk about that recently because in fact the Nashville SC season isn't even at the same time as the season of most soccer teams in Europe. The soccer teams in Europe basically have like a school calendar. It starts kind of towards the end of August, ends in May, and that leaves the summer for international tournaments like the World Cup or the Gold Cup or the European Championships. And so it's fairly uniform. And that's one of the reasons they do it. But another reason they do it is because there are certain competitions where the different leagues in Europe come together and combine their teams to see who the best teams in Europe are.
So they're trying to do a little bit of that in the United States. We have the League Cup that they play with the Mexican teams, which from my perspective have been some of the best games we've had here. The fans of the Mexican teams really get into it, and it's been some electric atmospheres because of that.
The difference in how European teams handle their trading of players, for lack of a better term, is significant. In European soccer, you can actually loan a player to another team, which means they pay you an amount of money for that player's services for a given amount of time. But once that given amount of time is up, it reverts that player's rights revert back to the other team. Now, oftentimes that player ends up having a successful stay and they negotiate some sort of deal to actually have a full trade go through. But it reminded me of my law school classes about life estates and real estate and reverting back to certain people upon the end of one's life. That's one difference because you can't loan a player to another team over here. Number two is when you want to buy another player, you would actually pay a transfer fee to a team. So let's say this happens a lot when you have a player who bursts out as a star for a lesser team. Let's take a team like Leicester City, who won probably the biggest upset in the history of the Premier League when they won the Premier League title in 2016 at 5,000 to 1 odds.
And they've been relegated since then.
They have. Their best player, Jamie Vardy, who actually did stay loyal to them, but he kind of burst onto the scene. If a Manchester United or like a little bit lesser historical club like Manchester City wanted to buy Jamie Vardy, they would they would make an offer.
He's not buying his own ridiculous stuff.
They would make an offer to Leicester City for an amount of money to then try to negotiate terms with Jamie Vardy. And then if they're successful in negotiating those terms with Jamie Vardy, then that lesser team gets funds. And it's a really good system. It's actually a system I've proposed for NIL in college athletics, which is where, okay, this lesser team, and when I say lesser team, less accomplished, less financially stable, they are going to lose this awesome player because they don't have the funds to pay him. But at least they're rewarded with some funds for the investment that they made in this player and correctly deciding that this player was going to be successful, and they can use that money to rebuild the rest of their roster, so they're not left high and dry.
Well, that, and I think one thing that I would add to that would be when these teams get relegated to the championship level, they have nowhere near the amount of TV money coming in. So the fact that AFC Richmond lost 0 of their players and then added Jamie Tartt back is probably something that wouldn't really happen.
So there's one instance where it has happened recently. Wrexham United, they were bought by Ryan Reynolds
Rob McElhenney.
and Rob McElhenney, and they're actually made a really successful show on FX. And they kind of they saw this investment opportunity. They could buy Wrexham, who was in the 5th division, which was outside of the football league table. And they bought Wrexham United, which had a long history, but was in a really bad way for not very much money. And they've been able to pump more money into that team than would be typical of a team in that level. And they've risen and risen and risen to the point where next year they're going to be playing in the 2nd division, which is a meteoric rise.
You pointed out something that is how you do that. If you can artificially pay more than what your finances are, which means you've had a very wealthy person or rich person buy your team for a year or two, you can, to a certain level, buy your way up the talent chain. I mean, even this year, Leeds was relegated last year. They didn't totally destroy their team, and now they're going back up in 1 year. Sunderland's another good example, one of the really good Netflix documentaries. And one are relegated both times during that series.
And one of the main reasons that doesn't happen in American sports is because in most of our professional sports, we have what's called a salary cap, where they're essentially trying to make sure that teams spend similar amounts of money so that it's really cyclical. They reward teams who play poorly with good draft picks at the end of the year. In America, we want our professional sports cycling. In European sports, the rich get richer, and sometimes, unfortunately, the poor get poorer.
We talked about earlier these 5 levels of professional soccer that are real professional soccer in England. And so you can actually get relegated from each one of those if you're one of the 3 or 4 worst teams, depending on levels. Some of them 3, some of them are 4, and then get raised up 3 or 4, depending on what level they are. It's set up in a very fun way. Like the championship level, the first 2 teams are automatically sent up. And then, 3, 4, 5, 6, they play in a tournament where one of them gets the golden carrot of going back to the Premier League if they win that, which adds another layer for winning that regular season title, where you have another chance to get up there and get something that's worth hundreds of millions of dollars more in revenue.
Something I see a lot in European soccer is celebrations for many different reasons. So some of the biggest celebrations you'll see, I think, saw an enormous one in Hamburg, Germany, when their team got moved up to be in the top flight for the first time in a very long time. Seen it with Leeds twice recently. is that getting promoted is like winning a championship. That's what everybody's fighting for. And what I really love about the structure in Europe is that if you're in 11th, you're going to fight to get in 10th or ninth. Every level that you can increase is a good thing. Because of how cyclical we want sports to be in America, if you are not going to make the playoffs in the NBA or the NFL, you're often almost motivated to do poorly because those teams get a higher draft pick and those teams basically are getting all sorts of help from the league to try to rise up so that they can get their turn. In Europe, there's never motivation to do poorly. If you're at the bottom of the table, you want to do well so that you can avoid relegation. If you're in the middle of the table, you want to do well to maybe try to get into one of those Champions League spots at the top of the table.
Yeah, so the Champions League right now, the Premier League is the top 5 spots. That means a quarter of those teams are getting that. There's tons of money involved with that, where you're playing some of the best teams in the world at that. It's the biggest soccer competition in the world outside of these 4 or 5 European leagues that are so highly thought of. But, I mean, right below that, I mean, is the Europa League. That's a big deal to win that too. And
It,
it's if you win the Europa League, you get to play in the Champions League the next year.
Right, and if you finish in 14th in the Premier League, you make more money than the team who finished in 15th. It's really designed to motivate people. You mentioned this earlier, but the the game where the winner of the teams 3 through 6 in the championship are playing to go up into the Premier League is famously noted as the most financially incentivized game in the world because the difference in the money that you're going to make the next year based on the results of that game is enormous because the Premier League television contracts are absolutely huge and the level down is nowhere near that.
Well, even the FA Cup, which this episode is that we've been talking about is a really big deal to win it because then you're considered you've won for the whole of England. And this year, I think it was Crystal Palace who actually beat Man City in the final. Crystal Palace is the actual location of the Premier League team that where they filmed the soccer stuff for Ted Lasso.
So the FA Cup, that brings up a good point. What I really like about European soccer is that there are multiple competitions going on at one time. So you have your primary league, and in the Premier League, you play every team twice, once home and once away. You get 3 points for a win, 1 point for a tie. They add up the totals at the end. There are no playoffs or anything. That's your champion. And the top 5 teams from that go to the Champions League, which is a collection of different leagues like Spain and uh, France and Italy and Germany and Portugal, and they kind of take the best teams from each of those leagues and put them together for a tournament. There is also, in addition to that, the FA Cup, which is the oldest national football competition in the world, and teams from the top 9 divisions of English football play in that tournament. And I think you mentioned earlier, th- some of the better teams, the bigger teams, get buys, so they may not join the competition until midway through. But you and your buddies could start a ninth league English soccer team and stack it, and you could shock the world. And then there's another tournament in England called the EFL Cup, and that is uh, the top 4 leagues can compete in that. So what's fun about this is, let's say you get off to a bad start in the Premier League. This year, for instance, Manchester United and Tottenham struggled, but they were both in the Europa Cup. And at the end of the season, they found themselves playing a game to try to get into the Champions League,
Mm.
despite not having success in the Premier League. So
Well, Tottenham won, I think, their first major trophy they've won
17
in
years.
a very long time.
Crystal Palace, I believe, had been over 100 years.
So, I mean, I love that too. I mean, it's not just one thing that you're going after with the trophy. They all talk about how many trophies you win in a year, when like Man City winning the treble or the quadruple, that's very unusual for that to happen. It's normally different teams win. So you have often, 4 or 5 fan bases that are pretty happy with their seasons if they win one of those trophies.
Now, part of the reason this structure works so well is that there are lots of teams in England. There's 20 teams in the Premier League, and I believe 24 teams apiece in the Championship, the first in League One and League Two. Part of that is because the culture of college sports is almost non-existent in England. So Whereas there's 32 NFL teams over here. While there are, like, right now, there's the UFL and there's been the XFL and the AAF in the past, the minor league football teams don't always work as well because there's so many college football fans. And so I think in a way, the second, third, fourth level teams almost kind of represent college sports in England. Uh, I also what I love about English football is that these teams are fabric of their community. You hear these stories of my granddad, my great granddad had season tickets. This is where we've sat for generations. They are part of their community. They wear many of them have a shield. It's like they wear it on their chest with pride. It feels a lot less corporate at times than professional sports over here, and it feels a lot more almost like college sports over here where people take pride of the team, not just in how they do in sports, but their identity and what it means to the community.
Yeah, and I believe it's done that way over there because that's how it's always been done, because a lot of these teams have become corporate, especially the top teams in the Premier Leagues that are trying to do everything they can to not be relegated. And, the college aspect to me, it comes more across in some of these, these documentaries I talked about watching, like when Sunderland, which is very, very important to their city, they get relegated that season. Then the second episode or the second season of that, they get relegated again down to the level below the championship league. And so the way these folks live and die with their team is very much the way, William and I here feel about University of Tennessee sports. And it's different for me, at least, for the professional sports versus what I care about with the college sports.
For
And
sure.
maybe it's because we went to school there and, we got to live it firsthand, but I think you're right. The way these communities have latched on to these soccer teams in England is very similar. And so what is the difference? Why doesn't the United States do it that way? To me, it's all about money.
For sure. I think Sunderland is a great example to bring up. Uh, in America, they do a better job of helping people protect their investment. I think Michael Jordan was a owner of the Charlotte Hornets slash Bobcats for a very long time. They had almost no success in his tenure as an owner, and then he sold them for way, way more than he bought them for. Just by the matter of being a professional sports team in America, you gain value. That's not the case over there. And in Sunderland's case, they have one of the larger stadiums in England, certainly top 15 or 20, the 45,000 seat stadium. Well, they found themselves in the third division playing in stadiums that were less than 10,000 people. And so their finances were all a mess. They couldn't pay for everything. And so, from a financial standpoint, the protections that are put in place over here are going to make those franchises more valuable. And it's part of the reason why, even though the MLS is probably the seventh or eighth best league in the world talent wise, they have some of the most valuable franchises in the world.
So I did some research on this for today about what the most, valuable teams in the world are. I looked at a few different articles on it, and among the top 50 valued teams in the world now, 19 of them are MLS teams, including, the most valuable of the teams right now is Inter Miami, where Messi plays. But that Inter Miami team, I mean, it's like the 15th most valuable team in the entire world in a country where we've had multiple professional soccer leagues fail in the past. This MLS stuff was started mainly related to trying to get the United States to be better in the World Cup stage. Started off with 10 teams that you could buy for like $1 to get into the MLS. National SC, when they came in 2020, they paid $150 million for that expansion team. Well, the next expansion team is going to be San Diego. They're paying $500 million for that team 5 years later just to get into the MLS. So what I take from that is two things. One, the American way is to not devalue your asset by allowing something as arbitrary as having one bad season stick you into where your team is worth 20, 30% of what it would be at the top level. The second thing I take from that is if you look long term on where the MLS is going, as more and more money is made, the revenue becomes bigger, the teams are more valuable. They at some point are going to at least be in the realm of what these great European leagues, whether it's the Bundesliga, the La Liga, the Premier League, the Premier League, the French league, the Italian leagues, which are kind of the five. Maybe Portugal would be next, but they're going to be in the neighborhood, maybe not of what the Premier League is, but I think some of these other, European leagues where you really like the French league is a good example of that. They have a few teams that are at that level. Paris Saint-Germain, PSG, where, Mbappe used to play, they are by far the best team in that league. And if you start getting down to, 15 through 20 in that one, it's nowhere near the same. So I don't know. It made me hopeful for just seeing what those valuations were. I mean, what do you think Man City's revenue was last year?
I can't imagine what it was. I would think the teams at the top of the table are still doing very, very well.
It's 869 million last year, and the highest for the MLS teams was Miami, which is 118 million.
That's way skewed because of
that's way skewed because of Messi. I mean, that's other teams are still have pretty healthy revenue where they're making 50, 75 million a year until they're able to charge their tickets, sell enough goods to make that kind of money. It's got to be hard to bridge that gap based on what the players charge. What is the rule in the MLS as far as being able to pay players at a higher rate? Do you know?
I think you get 3 player exceptions, and then after that, you have to pay some average of, you can't pay over X amount. Basically, there's a salary cap except for these 3 exempt players,
Yeah,
which is how players like David Beckham and Leo Messi and Luis Suarez have gotten to play over here.
designated players. So Beckham, I think when he came over and played here, was given the offer to have a franchise, which ultimately became this Miami franchise. He got to buy that for $25 million. I mean, it's the best investment he ever made in his life, was just simply coming over here and playing soccer in LA for a few years, which he probably wanted to do anyways at the end of his career. And I can't imagine that's not his number one asset now.
So the interesting part here is that it's clear that the promise that your team will not be relegated into a lower league is driving up values of these teams, the protections that affords. Because think about it, I mean, Manchester United, it was once said that 1 out of every 9 people in the world was a Manchester United fan. They were 2 spots away from being relegated this year. It wasn't that close, but no one is safe forever. It's like you said, when you're one bad year away, some injuries, some problems, and that would cause huge problems that would take a long time to dig out of. That being said, because of Champions League, because of the fact that these teams do get together for this huge competition, I think the ceiling of value in Europe, that combined with the fact that it's clearly their number one favorite sport, while over here we've got football and basketball and baseball and you name it. Uh, I think the ceiling is still much, much higher, at least for now, with the European teams that don't have salary caps that really can sky's the limit. But that top, 19 of the top 50 is telling that this model of relegation is, while it's really entertaining for fans, is really, really risky for owners.
Well, if you do the math on that, if we've got 19 MLS teams and only 11 of the Premier League teams in there, that means there's 9 of those current Premier Team leagues are worth less than those other 19 MLS teams, which is crazy. I never would have guessed that.
It's wild, and I can promise you those 9 Premier League teams are better than any of the MLS teams in terms of skill.
Definitely. And where I would come down on it is, I mean, I think it'd be super cool if we did that here, but the likelihood of that happening is about 0. I think probably a better way to grow the game here. I think it'd be awesome if we could somehow have the MLS and the Mexican teams play in the same league, because the level of fandom that they bring, I think it would elevate the entire league. And interestingly enough, there was only one Mexican league team in the top 50.
So What my suggestion would be, which is something that's being talked about anyway, is to start playing our season at the same time as European teams and trying to buy into these competitions. Like, let us have 2 teams in the Champions League. Let us have 2 teams in Europa, something like that. Now, it's gonna be tougher
That would
because
be super cool.
it would be awesome. It's gonna be tougher because the top end, we have these salary caps that kind of make it to where all of our teams are more similar to each other than overseas, where you said that like even the Premier League, which is the most balanced of the big leagues, has 6 big teams. You know, Spain is very top heavy with Real Madrid, Barcelona, Atletico, and like you said with France, with Paris Saint-Germain. It might be tough sledding, but it would still bring eyes to the game. So the first step to me would be, let's get on the same season. Let's let the best players in MLS not have to take time away from their MLS team to play in the World Cup and to play in competitions like that, and then go from there, because we're at a pivotal point in MLS soccer where, all right, we're starting to see some gains. What's the next step?
I would add one more thing. This is a personal observation more than anything. They need to have some of their weekend games, more of their weekend games be at times that children can go see them. I mean, 95% of the games we go to here in Nashville SC, we're season ticket holders and go to a lot of games. They're all at 7:30. And so if your goal is to try to grow the game and you actually want kids to, 12 and under to go see them to try to build the next generation of your fandom, give them a time they can go where they're not staying up till 10:30 or 11.
Ironically, I associate my soccer watching with being up early in the morning because I watch so much European soccer, and because of the time difference, you're often watching a huge game at 9 a.m. in the morning. So there's a place for both in the world, and I look forward to seeing where it develops over the next 10 years or so.
Well, I'll tell one more aside about the difference in how they do finances, how they do in the United States versus here. One of my favorite of all those documentaries I watched was the one on Borussia Dortmund. They went through what is a European version of bankruptcy is for their team as being one of the top 2 teams in that Bundesliga forever. Did they fire their director that led them into that? They did not. They let them lead them out of it too. That never would have happened here. And part of what I loved about that particular one is he realized, some of the errors they've made along the way. They let them lead out of it, and they're one of the 2 strongest teams in Germany even now.
It kind of reminds me of like Bobby Bowden, who had so much success at Florida State. They could have left him high and dry when towards the end of his career he wasn't winning as many games, but they showed him respect and loyalty for everything he had done for that program for a long time.
It's similar to that, yeah. So I mean, if you get them to the promised land, give them some extra quarter. So we unfortunately didn't do that with our great coach at Tennessee, and it led to 10 years or so of pretty rough times. So gotta be loyal. It's important.
We love you, Coach Fulmer.
We love you, Coach Fulmer, and that's part of what makes this show so wonderful. Is you have, Ted Lasso at the end of that season 1 comes in and tries to resign after they get relegated. Rebecca realizes that she's not done this coach right, and he gave it everything he got, brings them back, and within a year, they're back up in the Premier League again. So be kind, be loyal, and your life's going to go pretty well.
Well, this was a fun one. We appreciate you joining us for the Pop Culture Courtroom. I'm William Mayfield.
And I'm Matt Hardin. We'll see you next time.
The Pop Culture Courtroom is a Matt Hardin Law production.
If you're a loved one that's been injured in a car wreck or other personal injury incident, call the law firm, the Tennesseans Trust.
Visit matthardinlaw.com or call 615-200-1111 for your free consultation today.